Hey nerdy knitters! If you're a newer knitter, you've probably seen lots of different stitch patterns that you're not even sure what they mean. Well, there are 5 basic ones that every knitter should know how to do, and we're going to cover them today. We'll look at each pattern, the fabric characteristics, when you should use it, why it's used, how to read the written instructions and the chart for flat or knitting in the round, and we'll even cover how to count your stitches and rows in that stitch pattern. Before we jump in, let me just say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. The first stitch pattern we're going to look at is garter stitch, this fabric right here. It's squishy, it's textured, it's stretchy, it's reversible, and it lies flat, which makes it great for a lot of different uses. It's commonly used for hems and edges where you want to keep things from curling. And garter stitch can be worked over any number of stitches or any number of rows. All you're doing is knitting if you're knitting it flat. This is what the written instructions would look like if you're going to work this flat. Row 1, knit, and then you just continue to repeat that row as many times as you need. Now, if you're going to look at a chart for garter stitch worked flat, this is what it would look like. A knitting chart shows what the fabric looks like on the front of the work, and those little bumps show us that this fabric is textured. Each of those bumps sort of displays the ridges that you would see in garter stitch. And just like the written instructions, on the right side you knit, and if you look at the key here, it's telling us on the wrong side you knit as well. And even though you're knitting on the wrong side, you need a different symbol because it's showing us that it's going to produce that purl texture on the front. What's interesting is what happens when you work garter stitch in the round. Here are the written instructions. Round 1 and all odd rounds you knit. Round 2 and all even rounds you're going to purl. And you'll repeat those 2 rounds for all of the rounds that you're knitting. While we get that interesting texture from knitting flat back and forth in rows, it's the act of turning your work and knitting on the other row that gives us these bumps on the front. And if you're knitting in the round, you don't get that effect unless you add those rows of purling as well. This is what the chart would look like if you were going to knit in the round. Now that key represents knitting and purling, not knitting on the right side and wrong side rows. You'll see that this time the numbers are all along that left edge because we're working in the round. We're not working flat back and forth in rows. Round 1, it shows us that we knit. Round 2, it shows us that we purl. And we alternate those rounds for the length of our project. Now, how do you read your knitting? How do you know how many rows and stitches you've knit? Well, to count the rows, you look at the ridges in the fabric. Each of these ridges is 2 rows of knitting. So you would count each one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Just like that, count all of the ridges. To count your stitches, you look at the smiles and the frowns. Those smiles and frowns. Each of the frowns is 1 stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you would count those frowns across the row to count your stitches. Stockinette stitch is another commonly used fabric. You can see that it's smooth and it has distinct columns and rows of little V's. Each of those V's is a stitch. It's not reversible. The other side is called reverse stockinette. We'll look at that in a minute. And while this one has been blocked so it will lay flat, stockinette has a tendency to curl. So while it's commonly used as an all-over fabric for many garments, it has to include some type of edge stitch like garter stitch or a rib to keep those edges from curling. And like garter stitch, it can be worked over any number of stitches and rows. This is what the written instructions would look like if you were going to work it flat. Row 1 you knit, row 2 you purl, and you repeat those 2 rows to work stockinette stitch. If this were written as a chart, this is what it would look like. As you can see, the chart looks blank, but that's because it's showing us how our fabric looks, and stockinette looks very flat and smooth. So it's showing us on our right side rows are those odd numbers 1, 3, and 5 we are knitting, and then on the wrong side rows we are purling to maintain that smooth fabric. Now, stockinette stitch in the round is really nice because all you're doing is knitting. This is the written instructions. Round 1 you knit, and then you repeat that round as many rows as you need. And the only change in our chart is that all of the numbers are now on that one side to represent that we're knitting in the round and not knitting flat back and forth in rows. Now, reading your knitting in stockinette is pretty easy as well. You're just going to look for those V's. Each of those columns of V's and there's a row of V's. You would count each V to count your stitches. So if you were counting rows, you would count your V's going upwards. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and continue like that. If you wanted to count your stitches, you would count your V's going across. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, if you flip your stockinette over, you have what's called reverse stockinette. This is the textured side of stockinette fabric. It's not reversible because the other side is that smooth stockinette. And like stockinette, it will curl. Commonly used as an all-over fabric where something more textured than plain stockinette is desired, but it also must include some type of edge stitch like garter stitch or a rib to keep the edges from curling. And like stockinette, it can be worked over any number of stitches and rows. Now this is the written instructions for reverse stockinette worked flat. Row 1, you purl. Row 2, you knit. So it's just the opposite of stockinette. And you repeat those 2 rows for the length of your knitting. And here is what the chart would look like. Now this one is the exact opposite of our stockinette chart, which looked blank. Now this one is full of purl stitches, but they represent the same thing. They're showing those purl bumps all on the front of the fabric. Now if you're going to work this in the round, you would purl every round. And here's a chart of what that would look like in the round. As you can see, it's just the 1 stitch repeated every round. Now if you had to count your stitches in rows in reverse stockinette, the easiest thing to do is to flip it over and count the V's on this side. But if you wanted to count on this side, you're going to look at those smiles and frowns again. And each of those frowns is 1 stitch. You could count them going across that way, or you could count them going up. Each frown is a stitch. Knit 1, purl 1 rib, also called 1x1 rib, is stretchy and elastic, and it's commonly used for hems and cuffs where you want something stretchy and it will keep that stockinette stitch from curling. It's also reversible. While it generally uses an even number of stitches because you're knitting 1, purling 1, knitting 1, purling 1, if you don't add an edge stitch, then you'll have a knit on one side and a purl on the other, and that is not balanced. So if we look at the chart for this stitch pattern, we add 1 extra stitch to balance the pattern. Now we have this red box, and that represents the pattern repeat across the row. You'll start by knitting 1, and then you'll purl 1, knit 1 until your final stitch. And that first knit 1 and the last knit 1 help you balance your pattern so each side is exactly the same. Now if we look at the written instructions along with this chart, that asterisk represents that red box. It tells us what we're repeating across the row. We didn't see this for stockinette, reverse stockinette, and garter because those can be worked over any number of stitches. So our first row sets up the pattern. Knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 across the row, beginning and ending with a knit to balance the pattern. And then once you've established the pattern, sometimes you'll see these words, maintain the pattern as established, or it could say knit the knits and purl the purls. All that means is once you've worked that first row, you're just going to knit the knits and purl the purls. You're going to knit them as they present. Now to work this in the round, these are the written instructions. Round 1, knit 1, purl 1, and we have that asterisk again because we're just going to continue doing those 2 stitches to the end of the round. And this one is worked over an even number of stitches. Because we're working in the round, we don't need an edge stitch for the other edge. Once you've established that pattern, you'll continue that pattern in the round. And once you've gotten used to reading your stitches in stockinette, then you can just use that to read your rib. You would just count that column of V's to count how many rows you've knit. And if you had to count across, you could just count your columns of stitches and the purl ditches in between. Once you understand knit 1, purl 1 rib, you can apply the same principles to knit 2, purl 2 rib. It's a bit of a wider rib, but it's stretchy, not quite as stretchy. It's reversible and it will keep your fabric from curling if you work it on stockinette. And it's also great for hems and cuffs and any place where you want some stretch. Here are the written instructions and the chart for working knit 2, purl 2 rib flat. Now we're really working into that multiples. We have a multiple of 4 stitches here. That means you need to have 4 stitches or 8 stitches or 16 stitches, something that can be divided by 4. And then we have a plus 2. That's added to balance our pattern. If we start with 2 knits, we want to end with 2 knits. Otherwise, our pattern won't be balanced. If you look at this swatch here, you can see it starts with 2 knits, but it ends with 2 purls. So each side looks different. They don't look the same. So our row instructions tell us to knit 2, and then we see that asterisk, and that tells us what we need to repeat. We're repeating what's between the first asterisk and that semicolon after it. And then row 2, that is reversed, but really you're just maintaining the pattern that you've established in the first row, and you'll continue to work that for as many numbers of rows as you need. And you can see that multiple demonstrated in this chart as well with the red box. It's telling us the stitches that we need to repeat. And on the right side rows, we are knitting, then purling, knitting, then purling, and then on the wrong side rows, we start with purl stitches and then knit stitches and then purl stitches across the row. When you work knit 2, purl 2, rib in the round, it's worked over a multiple of 4 stitches with no balancing stitches needed, because you don't have to balance one edge with the other since there are no edges, it's in the round. So looking at our written instructions and our chart, we can see that our repeat begins right away. Knit 2, purl 2, and repeat from that to the end of the round. Once you've established that, then you can continue working that, knitting your knits and purling your purls as you established in that first row. And reading the stitch pattern is just like reading your knit 1, purl 1 rib. Look for a column of knit stitches and then just count each of those stitches to see how many rows you have knit. And if you need to count across, then you can count by 2s, counting your knit stitches and those purl stitches in between. Now you understand 5 basic stitch patterns that every knitter needs to know how to work, and you can confidently use them in any project you might need them. If you're looking for some beginner knitting projects, check out this video right here, and if you like to get nerdy with your knitting, be sure to subscribe.